There was once a city so confident in itself that it believed it could never fall. Its walls were so high and thick that armies trembled at the sight of them. And yet, one day, they collapsed at the sound of trumpets and a single cry of faith. How could an entire civilization crumble without a sword being raised? What secrets did Jericho hide behind its walls? And what lessons does it still teach us thousands of years later? Today, we'll walk through Jericho as you've never seen it before, not just as an ancient city, but as a mirror of our own lives. In the heart of the Jordan Valley, surrounded by a hot and arid climate that seemed uninhabitable, stood a city that defied all logic, Jericho. Where the desert imposed silence and scarcity, a spring gushed that never ran dry. This spring, known since ancient times as the spring of Elisha, turned what could have been barren land into an oasis of life. Around those waters, palm trees, wheat fields, and vineyards flourished, making Jericho a place of abundance in the midst of desolation. For that reason, many called it the City of Palms. This unique feature made it stand out. While other towns struggled each season to find water, Jericho rose as a refuge of fertility, self-sufficiency, and wealth. It's no coincidence that Jericho is considered one of the oldest, continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Archaeology confirms that human settlements existed there more than 8,000 years ago, long before Joshua and the people of Israel approached its gates. Jericho was no improvised village. It was the result of centuries of civilization, learning to harness a privileged geography. Its people not only cultivated the land, but also controlled trade routes connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia and the Arabian desert with the mountains of Canaan. Every traveler, every caravan, every army crossing that region had to pass through Jericho one way or another. That position made it a strategic treasure everyone longed to control. But what made Jericho truly feared were not its riches nor its trade. It was its walls. Massive structures that rose as a challenge to the heavens. They were not symbolic barriers or fragile clay defenses. They were double fortifications, an outer wall lower and wider, and an inner wall taller and narrower, both built on stone foundations with sun-dried mud bricks. Between them was an open space designed to trap any invading force that managed to breach the first wall. For the armies of the ancient world, entering a city like this was nearly impossible. Some archaeological studies suggest these walls reached over 9 meters, 30 feet, in height, and more than 3 meters, 10 feet, thick. They were so wide that, as stories say, chariots could move along the top of them. Imagine the scene. From atop those ramparts, watchmen surveyed the valleys and caravan routes, day and night. Just the sight of those towering walls was enough to intimidate any enemy. Jericho was a fortress in every sense of the word, a city designed to resist centuries of siege. It wasn't just stone and clay. It was a message, a declaration that human strength was more reliable than divine power. Its citizens grew up under the shadow of those walls, told since childhood that their city was unconquerable. Their confidence wasn't rooted in humility or faith in a higher power, but in the architecture that surrounded them. Each brick was a statement of self-sufficiency, each watchtower a monument to pride. Thus, Jericho became not only a physical city, but a symbol, a manifestation of human arrogance raised as an idol. But pride always comes at a price. Those who believe themselves invincible often ignore the warnings. And Jericho, in its prosperity, trade, and military power, hardened itself against anything that didn't fit within its system. Where other nations saw their limits, Jericho built more walls. Where others admitted fragility, Jericho proclaimed itself untouchable, and it was precisely that arrogance that turned the city into the perfect stage for a divine act that would echo through eternity. Before that moment, however, it's worth understanding what Jericho represented in its time. It was not just another Canaanite city, it was a symbol. For neighboring peoples, its name evoked wealth, order, military might, and idol worship. Its caravans crossed the valley laden with spices, linen, and oil. Its warriors marched with confidence, knowing they had a fortress to return to. Its priests proclaimed that their local gods protected the city. In essence, Jericho embodied everything Canaan stood for: fertility, trade, idolatry, and human pride. When the Israelites arrived after miraculously crossing the Jordan, they did not encounter a defenseless village. They faced the jewel of the valley, a city that represented both the best and the worst of Canaanite civilization. To bring down Jericho was not merely to open the way for conquest. It was to challenge the very heart of the system that had ruled the land for centuries. Every brick in its wall was more than hardened clay. It was a spiritual statement. We trust in our own strength, not in the God of Israel. That's why the fall of Jericho became more than a military victory. It was the collapse of human arrogance before divine power. A reminder that no wall, no matter how high or thick, can stand when God has decreed its fall. The walls that for generations had been Jericho's safety became the very proof of its downfall. What they worshipped as their salvation became the symbol of their destruction. From this perspective, Jericho was far more than a place on a biblical map. It was a scene filled with spiritual and prophetic meaning. It was the first city Israel had to face upon entering the Promised Land. And it wasn't chosen by chance. God began the conquest with the most formidable city, as if to show that no matter how strong the walls of a nation may seem, its fate rests in heaven's hands. In this way, Jericho became more than a name. It became an archetype, a mirror through which every generation could see itself. It represents blind trust in material power, human pride that forgets the spiritual, and the arrogance of believing that man-made walls can stand firmer than the mighty decrees of God. And here's where the story grows even more fascinating. While Jericho's people slept peacefully behind their walls, convinced that nothing could touch them, a small nation camped outside, one without catapults or advanced weapons, prepared to prove that true strength lies not in stone, but in obedience to a voice higher than the heavens. Jericho, the city that could not be conquered, was about to learn that its walls were not as invincible as they seemed, and the echo of their fall would not only shake the earth in their time, but would resonate through history as an eternal reminder that human self-sufficiency always surrenders before the power of God. Within those towering walls, life pulsed with a vibrant and constant rhythm. Imagine crossing Jericho's eastern gate at dawn. The first thing you would hear was a growing murmur. Merchants arranging their goods, animals groaning in makeshift pens, women carrying baskets of freshly baked bread, the bleating of goats and sheep blending with the rhythmic clatter of clay jars. The air was thick with the scent of spices brought by distant caravans, cumin, saffron, cinnamon, mingling with the aroma of wine poured into earthen jugs, and the smoke from small altars burning beside the market stalls. The marketplace of Jericho was the heart of the city. There, people did far more than buy and sell. They wove social networks, forged political alliances, and exercised religious influence. Traders shouted prices at the top of their lungs, raising their hands to display fabrics dyed in royal purple, a symbol of wealth and prestige. Others offered olive oil in carefully sealed jars, sweet wine from the nearby hills, polished metals, and carved wooden idols. Coins were rare, Bartering ruled the economy. A sack of grain could be worth as much as a goat, and a handful of salt was as valuable as an iron tool. Everything depended on need, rarity, and urgency. Yet behind that bustling economy lay something far more complex. Many of those goods were offered in honor of local gods. Perfumed oils were sold as offerings to Baal. Clay figurines represented Asherah and were purchased to protect homes, and the priests received a portion of every transaction as a spiritual tax. Thus, the market was not merely a place of commerce. It was an open-air temple, where the sacred and the profane merged without boundaries. Families in Jericho grew up under this influence. Their homes, made of sun-dried adobe, looked humble from the outside, but were cleverly designed to endure the desert heat. Flat rooftops served as sleeping areas on cool nights and as drying spaces for food during the day. The inner courtyards were the true heart of each home. There they cooked in clay ovens, ground grain by hand, spun fibers for weaving, and children played while learning their parents' trades. There were no schools as we know them today. Education was practical and oral. Children learned by watching, listening to the elders' stories, and repeating rituals and songs that preserved the tales of Canaanite gods. Parents taught their children to till the land, tend livestock, and shape clay. Girls, from an early age, helped in the kitchen and in preparing offerings, learning prayers passed down through generations. Every daily act carried religious meaning. Bread was baked while invoking fertility. Rain was requested with chants to Baal, and childbirth was accompanied by prayers to Asherah. The temples were the most imposing structures after the city walls. There, priests and priestesses performed rituals that went far beyond the offering of fruit or animals. They engaged in frenzied dances, blood sacrifices, and in the darkest moments, even acts of self-mutilation or human sacrifice. Believing that the more costly the offering, the greater the favor received. Such practices were so normalized that they became an indispensable part of community life. Children grew up witnessing scenes that to us would seem horrifying, but to them were simply the path to blessing. Jericho's prosperity was so tied to these customs that no one dared question them. Wealth was seen as proof of divine favor, even if it came from false gods. The merchant who sold the most gave thanks to Baal. The woman who bore many children dedicated each birth to Asherah. Clan leaders held feasts in honor of the deities as signs of gratitude. Economy and spirituality were interwoven into a single structure of power. But beneath that apparent stability, cracks were forming. Life within the walls was sustained by a system that fed greed, exploitation, and fear. The powerful recorded debts on clay tablets, charging excessive interest to the poor. Entire families could lose their land and even offer their children as servants to repay impossible debts. And in every injustice, the priests claimed it was the will of the gods, keeping a tight grip over people's consciences. The contrast was striking. While the marketplace overflowed with activity, life in the humble homes was marked by hardship and submission. Elders ruled family decisions with absolute authority, and women, though invisible in public life, sustained the household economy with tireless labor. Days passed between the ordinary and the ritual, between the struggle to survive and the hope of gaining the favor of gods who never answered. Idolatry permeated everything. Every street had small altars. Every home possessed amulets. Every corner reminded them that the city lived under distorted beliefs. Public festivals, filled with music, wine, and dancing, always ended in ceremonies invoking Baal or Asherah. Religion, rather than being a source of hope, had become a yoke, dictating how to live, how to trade, how to love, and even how to die. Such was life inside Jericho, prosperous, bustling, full of vitality, yet built upon fragile spiritual foundations. What seemed like wealth and stability to human eyes was, in divine eyes, corruption and arrogance. A city that gleamed on the outside, but hid a deep spiritual sickness within, one that, sooner or later, would bring consequences. And while the people of Jericho went about their daily routines, convinced that nothing could disturb their peace, a silent army was approaching from across the Jordan River. No one inside the walls yet imagined that the sound of a few trumpets would soon reveal that their sense of security was nothing more than an illusion. The sun was rising over the Jordan Valley, and its rays struck the walls of Jericho, making them gleam as if they were on fire. From the top, the watchmen looked out with their usual confidence, certain that their mighty walls were enough to keep any threat at bay. But that morning, something in the air felt different. A strange silence spread across the plain. There was no sound of merchants, no movement of caravans, only the slow, ordered advance of an army, not with catapults, not with weapons, but with perfect order and a disquieting calm. The people of Jericho crowded onto the walls to watch. At the front marched priests dressed in white linen, carrying ram's horn trumpets. Behind them, the Ark of the Covenant, covered with a shining veil, carried by Levitical priests, and behind them, an entire nation, walking in formation. They did not shout. They did not attack the gates. They simply walked, circling the city in silence while the trumpets blew long, echoing notes that seemed to pierce the soul. Picture the scene inside Jericho. Some laughed. Is that an army? Do they think our walls will fall just by walking around them? Their laughter echoed along the battlements. But in the eyes of others, something else began to appear: fear. There was something in that silence, that discipline, that visible faith that could not be explained by military logic. Day after day, for 6 days, the same ritual repeated. At dawn, the people of Israel appeared, circled the city once, the trumpets sounded, and then they returned to their camp. No battle cries, no attempts to climb the walls. Just that silent procession, carrying an invisible force. For the people of Jericho, it became unsettling. Why didn't they attack? Why didn't they retreat? What were they waiting for? Some still mocked, but their voices grew weaker. Others couldn't sleep at night. The priests of Baal and Asherah lit more altars, offered more sacrifices, begging their gods to strengthen the city. But nothing could silence the haunting echo of those trumpets. Then came the 7th day, and that morning was unlike any other. Instead of circling the city once, the Israelites began to march around Jericho. A second time, a third. With each turn, the tension grew heavier in the air. The inhabitants watched from above, their faces tight with unease. The laughter had vanished. Only an anxious silence remained, broken again and again by the piercing sound of the trumpets. The 4th circuit, the 5th, the 6th, each step of that army was like an invisible blow against Jericho's pride. And then, on the 7th circuit, the priests blew their trumpets once more. But this time, the sound was longer, louder, as if all of heaven itself joined in the roar. Joshua raised his voice and gave the order. The people shouted together, not a cry born of throats, but of faith, of obedience, of hearts united in divine purpose. And then the impossible happened. The walls began to tremble. First, a deep rumble like distant thunder. Then, cracks spread through the stone like veins. In an instant, what had seemed indestructible crumbled like sand. The towers fell. The walls collapsed inward, exposing what had been hidden for centuries. The noise was so great that the surrounding hills echoed it endlessly. The warriors of Jericho stood frozen. Their pride, their fortress, lay in ruins before their eyes. Amid the destruction, One detail remained untouched: the house of Rahab, marked with a scarlet cord. Rahab was no ordinary woman. She lived in a house built into the wall itself, and was known throughout Jericho for her past as a prostitute. But when the spies sent by Joshua came to the city, she chose to protect them, risking her life for a faith just beginning to awaken in her heart. She had heard the stories of the God of Israel, of the sea that opened, of the kings defeated, and she understood that he was the true God. That decision changed her destiny forever. While everything around her collapsed, her home stood firm, protected by the promise God had made through the spies. Amid the rubble and dust, Rahab's house rose as a silent testimony that faith can raise invisible walls, stronger than any wall of stone. In the horizon of ruin, her home was a light burning in the midst of judgment, a reminder that even in the darkest days, the faith of one person can move the hand of God. The conquest was not a triumph of military strategy. It was the declaration of an eternal principle. It is not human strength that conquers, but obedience to the voice of God. Jericho fell, but more than walls, what collapsed was a system. The idolatrous trade, the corrupted altars, the arrogance of a people who trusted in their own power, all were judged in an instant. That day was forever etched into Israel's memory as the moment when the impossible became real, not through weapons, but through faith. The sound of the trumpets and the echo of that collective cry did not only bring down a city, they tore through history itself. And their echo still resounds today, a timeless message that when God speaks, walls tremble. The walls of Jericho fell thousands of years ago, but their echo still resounds today. It wasn't just a city that collapsed. It was the arrogance of a people who trusted more in their walls than in the living God. And that lesson doesn't belong only to the past. It reaches each one of us in the present, because we all have walls, invisible fortresses we've built around our hearts. Walls made of pride, fear, disbelief, wounds we haven't healed, or secrets we refuse to reveal. Walls that make us feel safe, yet quietly imprison us. They may not be made of stone or clay, but they weigh just as much, sometimes even more. Think about it. What is your Jericho? It might be a habit you can't break, a wound you've carried for years, an insecurity whispering that you're not enough, or a fear that paralyzes you when you try to move forward. All of us, at some point, find ourselves circling a wall that seems unbreakable. And like the Israelites, we march around it day after day, praying, fighting, waiting to see a crack. But nothing moves. The story of Jericho reminds us that faith doesn't always produce instant results. Israel marched for 6 days without seeing a single stone fall. Everything looked the same, but each step was an act of obedience, a declaration of trust, a silent reminder that miracles don't depend on human calendars. They unfold in God's perfect time. Maybe you're in that same process right now, circling your wall in silence, seeing no change, thinking your prayers are unheard. Let me tell you something. Every step counts. Every prayer is heard. Every act of faith is one more lap that brings you closer to the moment of breakthrough. The 7th day always comes. Maybe not when you expect it, but it comes. And when it does, the shout doesn't rise from your throat. It comes from your soul. It's the result of faith accumulated over time, of unwavering obedience, of trust that refuses to die. And when that kind of faith is released, walls fall, supernaturally, completely, forever. But there's another lesson here: unity. The people of Israel didn't march alone. They marched together. Every man, every woman, every priest, every voice moved in the same rhythm. It wasn't an individual act, it was collective. That reminds us that many of life's greatest spiritual battles aren't won in solitude, but in community. When we walk together, when we pray in agreement, when our voices rise as one, strongholds that once seemed impossible begin to crumble. Just as the trumpets sounded in perfect unison, our united faith carries divine power. And even in the midst of judgment, there was grace. Rahab's house stood firm, marked by a scarlet cord. That image speaks to us of God's mercy. Even in the day of collapse, He has a plan of salvation for those who believe. Rahab, a woman judged by society, became part of the lineage of the Messiah. It reminds us that no matter your past, no matter what others say about you, if you choose to believe, if you decide to trust, God can write a new story upon your ruins. The fallen stones of Jericho became eternal witnesses of God's power. And just like them, your own broken walls will not be your shame. They will be your testimony. The place where you thought everything was ending can become the beginning of something new. Your ruins can turn into an altar. Your defeats into living memories of God's power in your life. Jericho still speaks to our ears and our hearts. Do not trust in your walls. Trust in the God who brings them down. Do not rely on your own strength. Surrender to the one who turns impossibilities into victories. The fall of that city was more than a conquest. It was a prophetic mirror for us. It shows that when we obey even without understanding, when we trust even without seeing, the supernatural happens. And now that you've walked through the streets of Jericho with me, its markets, its gods, its walls, and its fall, I want to ask you, what wall do you need to surrender today? What Jericho are you circling in your life? Don't carry it alone. Trust, persevere. Take one more lap, because the shout of faith always brings deliverance. Today, the ruins of Jericho still speak. Their fallen stones stand as witnesses that the impossible becomes possible when faith obeys. If this story spoke to your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Between Heaven and Earth. Let's make this space a collective wall of faith, a digital altar where we remember that ruins are never the end, but the beginning of what's new. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that God still brings down walls, because when a people believe and one voice rises, even the tallest walls must surrender. May God's blessing be with you.